Hey guys, I'm back to begin chapter 2 of The Boy Who Harnessed the Wind. And if you're just now joining us, don't worry, you haven't missed much. Michael is just kind of giving us some background information about his village where he grew up, some of their customs and beliefs. And one thing that a lot of the villagers rely on is what we would call witchcraft. So that was something interesting to learn about. So I would recommend going back and watching chapter 1. Chapter 2, Kamba. In January 1997, when I was 9 years old, my family experienced a sudden and tragic loss. One afternoon while working the fields, my Uncle John became very sick and fainted. My father rushed him to the small clinic in Wimby, where the doctor diagnosed him with tuberculosis, a deadly disease that seizes the lungs. They advised him to go right away to Kasungu Hospital, an hour's drive. But Uncle John's truck wasn't working, and by the time my father managed to borrow another car, his brother was dead. It was the first time I experienced someone dying, and the first time I ever saw my parents cry. I especially felt bad for Jeffrey, who was now left without a father. All the following day, people came by his house to comfort him and his mother and to pay their respects. Every so often, I saw him walk out of his house, crying and looking confused. "Cousin, what next?" he asked me. "What will happen?" All I could think to say was, "I don't know." Following Uncle John's death, things became very difficult. Now that my father's brother and business partner was gone, he had to manage the farm alone. It was now up to me and Jeffrey to help keep the farm successful. We all feared that difficult times were on their way. Not long after John's funeral, my uncle Socrates lost his job at a big tobacco estate in Kasungu. The family's home was also there, which meant they were forced to move back to our village. Uncle Socrates had 7 daughters, which was great news for my sisters. I myself could not care less about a bunch of girls, but as I helped my uncle unload the moving truck, something leaked out onto the ground. At my feet stood a big, slobbering dog. "Get back!" Socrates shouted and shooed the dog away, but it came right back, its eyes looking straight up at me. "That's our dog, Kamba," he said. "I figured we'd bring him along to guard the chickens and goats. That's what he did best at the estate." Kamba was the most unusual thing I'd ever seen. He was all white with large black splotches across his head and body, as if someone had chased him with a bucket of paint. His eyes were brown and his nose was peppered with bright pink dots. Unlike most other Malawian dogs, Kamba was also big, but still just as skinny. In most other parts of Africa, dogs were used to protect homes and farms. No one buys them as pets like they do in America, and they certainly don't lavish them with rubber toys and fancy food. In Malawi, dogs lived on mice and table scraps. In all my life, I'd never seen a fat dog. Very different than America. As Kamba sat there watching me, a thick strand of drool hung suspended from his tongue, and he smelled funny, like moldy fruit. As soon as Socrates walked inside, he jumped on his hind legs and planted both paws on my chest. Get away!" I shouted. I didn't want people thinking I was friends with a dog. Go chase some chickens or something. But Kamba didn't budge. I swore he even smiled at me. Early the next morning, I tripped over something on my way to the toilet. It was Kamba, lying square in my doorway, ears perked and waiting. "I thought I told you to leave me alone," I said, then stopped. I certainly didn't want people to see me talking to a dog. Walking back, I met Socrates in the courtyard. He pointed to the thing now attached to my shadow. "I see you found a friend," he said. "You know, the good Lord blessed me with 7 children, but all of them are girls who don't take much interest in dogs. I think Kamba is happy to have found a pal." "I am no friend to a dog," I said. Socrates laughed. Sure. Tell that to him." After that, I gave up trying to get rid of Kamba. In fact, I started to enjoy his company, and as much as I hated to admit it, he and I became friends. Excuse me. He slept outside my door each night, and when it got cold, he snuck inside the kitchen and curled up by the pots and pans. And just like Socrates said, he made a good watchdog over our chickens and goats, protecting them from the hyenas and wild dogs that roam the dark countryside. Even still, Kamba liked to play games with the baby animals. He chased them around the campground, causing the little goats to bleat and the mama hens to flare their wings and hiss. Whenever this happened, my mother would lean out of the kitchen and pitch one of her shoes at his head. "Stop that, you crazy dog!" she'd scream, and my sisters and I would laugh. Look who's talking to animals now. Aside from upsetting our livestock, Comba's favorite thing to do was hunt. By this time, going hunting had replaced most of the childhood games I used to play at home, and Comba provided the perfect partner. During the dry season, we hunted birds that drank from the dambo near my house, and in the rainy months, we followed them into the blue gum forest, where we set our traps and waited in the thickets. This kind of hunting required patience and quiet. Comba seemed to understand this naturally, as if he'd been hunting his whole life. One morning after the rains had stopped, Comba and I headed to the forest to set our traps. As always, I kept my tools and trap-making materials inside a cloth sack that I tied to the end of my hoe. Inside were a rubber bicycle tube, a broken bicycle spoke, a short piece of wire that I clipped from my mother's clothesline, a handful of maize shaft that we called gaga, and 4 heavy bricks. I also carried 2 knives that I crafted myself. The first was made from a thick piece of iron sheeting. After tracing a pattern in the metal, I'd taken a nail and poked holes all around the edges, then popped it out with a wrench. I sharpened the metal into a blade by rubbing it against a flat stone. For my handle, I wrapped the bottom half with plastic jumbo bags and melted them over a fire to make them hard. My second knife was a punching tool made from a sharpened nail, also equipped with a handle. I kept them both tucked inside the waistband of my trousers. We entered the forest just past the graveyard near Jeffrey's house, where the blue gums grew tall. In the distance, I could see the small mountain range called the Dowa Highlands that separated us from Lake Malawi, some 100 kilometers away. Dark clouds clung to the tops of the green hills, threatening rain. Let's hurry, Comba. We don't want to get wet. I found a good spot off the main trail to set our trap, then got to work. The type of trap I used is called a chikwampu. To make it, I first cleared a small section of grass and vines with my hoe until I could see the red dirt. Taking my knife, I cut 2 thick branches from a blue gum tree and whittled them to sharp points. Then I pushed them into the soft dirt and made sure they didn't move. I cut the bicycle tube into 2 strips and tied each piece to the ends of the steel clothesline wire. Then tied the rubber strips to the poles. When finished, it resembled a giant slingshot. The bark from a kahir tree is papery and durable and makes a fine rope. I stripped several long sections and tied them together and made a rope about 15 feet long. I attached it to the steel wire in my slingshot. Then I pulled the rubber as far as it would go, locking it between 2 bicycle spokes sticking out of the ground. This was my trigger. Once it was set, I stacked the 4 bricks directly behind the trap and sprinkled some gaga on the ground. Whenever birds landed to eat the bait, I'd pull the trigger and release the rubber sling, slamming them into the bricks. Let's hunt, I said. Comba's ears perked at the command, and he followed me into the trees. We hid behind a small bush and waited for our game. About 30 minutes later, a small flock of 4 birds swooped overhead and spotted the bait. I felt my pulse quicken as they turned and feathered down. I was about to pull the trigger when a 5th bird landed. He was giant, with a fat gray chest and yellow wings. Come on, I thought. Just a little more to the right, that's it. The fat bird pushed his way into the group and began to feed. With all the birds now inside the trap, I jerked the rope. Whoop, pop! The whole flock disappeared into a cloud of feathers and dust. Tonga! I shouted. Comba and I raced out to investigate. 4 birds lay dead against the bricks, while a 5th managed to fly away. I picked them up and brushed away the dirt, their limp bodies still warm in my hands. I placed them into my pockets. Now comes the fun part, I said. Comba's tail was wagging like mad. Let's go eat. Back at the house, I cleaned the birds and sprinkled the meat with a coat of salt. I then sharpened a blue gum sapling and ran it through the birds like a skewer. In the kitchen, I gathered a handful of sticks and built a small fire. Once my coals glowed red, I held the birds over the embers until each one was sizzling and brown. The delicious smell soon drew my sisters to the door, begging for a taste. My father had to intervene. Leave those guys alone. The 2 hunters worked hard today. Now let them enjoy their prize. The forest birds were small and bony, each one just a mouthful of meat, but even still, they tasted delicious. Comba didn't worry about bones at all. Just swallowed his birds in one quick gulp and wagged his tail for more. I started laughing. When it comes to hunting, you're very patient, I told him. But when it's time to eat, that's another story. And that's the end of chapter 2. We will be on chapter 3 tomorrow, which is called Discovering a Thing Called Science. So I will see you guys next time.